Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My name is Nathaniel, and 5 years ago I thought I had cracked the code to financial independence through what everyone calls the holy grail of wealth building, passive income. I had built a portfolio worth $14 million by age 32, generating over $80,000 per month in cash flow from a diversified mix of real estate investments, cryptocurrency holdings, and various other income-producing assets that required minimal day-to-day management from me. I was living the dream that every personal finance guru and wealth-building expert promises is possible if you just work hard enough, save aggressively enough, and invest intelligently enough for long enough. I had achieved true financial freedom, the kind of situation where money works for you instead of you working for money, where your passive income exceeds your living expenses by such a wide margin that you never have to worry about market fluctuations or economic uncertainty affecting your lifestyle. I was married to Persephone, a woman who seemed to share my passion for building wealth, and who had been instrumental in helping me research investments, manage properties, and optimize our financial strategies for maximum tax efficiency and cash flow generation. She was incredibly intelligent about finance and technology, with a background in accounting and business administration that made her an ideal partner for someone pursuing aggressive wealth-building strategies that required careful attention to legal structures, tax implications, and regulatory compliance. We worked together like a perfectly coordinated team, with me focusing on identifying and analyzing investment opportunities while she handled the administrative details, paperwork, and ongoing management tasks that were necessary to maintain our growing portfolio of income-producing assets. Our marriage seemed like the perfect combination of personal compatibility and professional partnership, built around shared goals and complementary skills that allowed us to achieve more together than either of us could have accomplished individually. I had no reason to suspect that Persephone was systematically destroying everything we had built together, using her intimate knowledge of our financial systems and her access to our accounts and legal documents to conduct what was essentially a slow-motion heist that had been going on for over 3 years without my knowledge. The foundation of our wealth-building strategy was real estate, specifically a portfolio of rental properties that I had been accumulating since my mid-20s when I first discovered the power of leveraging other people's money to acquire income-producing assets that would appreciate over time while generating monthly cash flow that exceeded the debt service payments. Our marriage seemed like the perfect combination of personal compatibility and professional partnership, built around shared goals and complementary skills that allowed us to achieve more together than either of us could have accomplished individually. I had no reason to suspect that Persephone was systematically destroying everything we had built together, using her intimate knowledge of our financial systems and her access to our accounts and legal documents to conduct what was essentially a slow-motion heist that had been going on for over 3 years without my knowledge. The foundation of our wealth-building strategy was real estate, specifically a portfolio of rental properties that I had been accumulating since my mid-20s when I first discovered the power of leveraging other people's money to acquire income-producing assets that would appreciate over time while generating monthly cash flow that exceeded the debt service payments. I started with a single duplex that I purchased with a conventional mortgage, lived in one unit while renting out the other, and used the rental income to help qualify for additional mortgages that allowed me to acquire more properties in a systematic pattern of growth that compounded over several years. By the time I met Persephone, I owned 12 rental units across 3 different markets, generating approximately $15,000 per month in gross rental income after accounting for vacancy rates, maintenance costs, property management fees, and debt service on the various mortgages I had used to acquire the properties. The real estate portfolio was structured through a series of limited liability companies that provided asset protection and tax advantages while allowing me to reinvest the cash flow into additional acquisitions rather than paying high personal income tax rates on rental profits. Persephone was fascinated by this business model and spent months learning everything she could about real estate investing, property management, tax strategies, and legal structures that could optimize our returns and minimize our risks. She took over most of the administrative responsibilities for the real estate portfolio, handling tenant communications, coordinating maintenance and repairs, managing the relationships with property management companies, and maintaining the detailed financial records that were necessary for tax reporting and investment analysis. Her involvement allowed me to focus on finding and analyzing new acquisition opportunities while she ensured that our existing properties were operating efficiently and profitably. The system worked beautifully for the first 2 years of our marriage, and our real estate portfolio grew to 28 units, generating over $40,000 per month in net cash flow, money that we were reinvesting into additional properties and alternative investments that would further diversify our income streams and reduce our dependence on any single market or asset class. The second major component of our wealth-building strategy was cryptocurrency investing, an area where I had been active since the early days of Bitcoin, when most people still considered digital currencies to be either a scam or a fad that would disappear once governments figured out how to regulate them effectively. I had accumulated significant positions in Bitcoin, Ethereum, and several other cryptocurrencies during periods when prices were relatively low, and I had developed sophisticated strategies for managing the extreme volatility that characterized crypto markets while still capturing the enormous long-term appreciation potential that these assets represented. My cryptocurrency holdings had grown to be worth over $4 million at their peak values, and I had implemented various income-generating strategies including staking, lending, and liquidity provision that produced additional cash flow beyond the capital appreciation that came from simply holding the coins for long-term appreciation. Persephone initially knew very little about cryptocurrency investing, but she was eager to learn and spent considerable time researching the technology, the market dynamics, and the various strategies that sophisticated investors were using to generate returns from digital assets. She became particularly interested in the technical aspects of blockchain technology and cryptocurrency custody, learning how to use hardware wallets, multi-signature security systems, and other advanced tools that were necessary for safely storing and managing large cryptocurrency positions. Her technical competence and attention to detail made her an invaluable partner for managing our crypto investments. And I gradually delegated more and more of the day-to-day management responsibilities to her, while I focused on higher-level strategic decisions about portfolio allocation and market timing. She handled the routine tasks of monitoring prices, rebalancing positions, executing trades, and managing the various accounts and wallets where our cryptocurrency holdings were stored across multiple exchanges and custody solutions. The third component of our wealth-building strategy was a diversified collection of other passive income investments, including dividend-paying stocks, real estate investment trusts, peer-to-peer lending platforms, business partnerships, and various alternative investments that could generate cash flow without requiring active management from us. These investments were smaller individually than our real estate and cryptocurrency positions, but collectively they represented several $1 million in assets that were producing steady monthly income that helped stabilize our overall cash flow and reduce the volatility that came from having large concentrations in real estate and crypto markets. Persephone was responsible for researching and monitoring these investments, ensuring that they continued to perform according to our expectations and that any problems or opportunities were identified and addressed promptly. She maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking the performance of every investment, prepared monthly reports summarizing our income and expenses, and provided recommendations for portfolio adjustments that would optimize our risk-adjusted returns while maintaining the high level of passive income that was our primary objective. Her analytical skills and attention to detail were remarkable, and I trusted her judgment completely when it came to making decisions about our investment portfolio. The lifestyle that this passive income strategy enabled was exactly what I had dreamed about when I first started investing in rental properties and cryptocurrency during my 20s. We lived in a beautiful home that was completely paid for, traveled extensively to exotic locations around the world, pursued hobbies and interests that we were passionate about, and generally enjoyed a level of freedom and security that very few people ever achieve.
More importantly, we have the time and financial resources to focus on our relationship, our personal development, and our long-term plans for the future without the stress and uncertainty that comes from depending on employment income or active business operations that require constant attention and management.
The passive income from our investments was sufficient to cover all of our living expenses with substantial surplus remaining that we could reinvest to continue growing our wealth or use for philanthropic activities and other purposes that were important to us. I felt like I had achieved the ultimate goal of financial independence, creating a situation where money was no longer a constraint on any decision we wanted to make about how to live our lives. The success of our wealth-building strategy was attracting attention from other investors and financial advisors who wanted to understand how we had been able to generate such high levels of passive income while maintaining diversification and managing risk effectively. I began speaking at real estate investing conferences and cryptocurrency meetups, sharing our story and our strategies with audiences of aspiring investors who were trying to achieve similar levels of financial independence. Persephone often accompanied me to these events, and her knowledge and insights about the operational aspects of managing a large investment portfolio were valuable additions to the presentations I would give about our overall investment philosophy and approach. We seemed like the perfect example of a couple who had worked together to achieve extraordinary financial success through disciplined investing and careful planning. And our story was inspiring to other people who were pursuing similar goals. Several financial publications wrote articles about our investment strategies, and we were occasionally interviewed by podcasters and bloggers who were focused on passive income and financial independence topics. The attention was flattering and seemed to validate the approach we had taken to building wealth, but it also meant that our financial situation was becoming more visible to the public, something that would later prove to be both advantageous and problematic when the true nature of our situation became apparent. During this period of growing public recognition and continued investment success, I had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong with our financial situation or our marriage. Persephone seemed genuinely enthusiastic about our shared goals, knowledgeable about our investment strategies, and committed to our long-term partnership in both personal and financial terms. She would often surprise me with detailed analyses of new investment opportunities she had identified, comprehensive reports on the performance of our existing holdings, and thoughtful recommendations for optimizations and improvements that could increase our passive income or reduce our risk exposure. Her contributions to our wealth-building efforts seemed invaluable, and I frequently told friends and colleagues that I couldn't have achieved the level of success we had reached without her partnership and expertise. The monthly income statements that Persephone prepared showed consistent growth in our passive income streams, steady appreciation in our asset values, and healthy cash flow that exceeded our living expenses by substantial margins that allowed for continued reinvestment and lifestyle enhancement. The financial reports she provided were detailed and professional, including comparisons to previous periods, analysis of trends and patterns, and projections for future performance based on current market conditions and our planned investment activities. Everything appeared to be working exactly according to our plans, and our net worth continued to grow at rates that exceeded our most optimistic projections when we had first developed our wealth-building strategy. I was completely confident in our financial position and in Persephone's management of the operational details that were necessary to maintain and optimize our investment portfolio. The first subtle indication that something might be wrong came during our 4th year of marriage, when I noticed that our monthly spending seemed to be increasing faster than I would have expected, given that our lifestyle hadn't changed dramatically and we weren't making any major purchases that would account for significantly higher expenses. When I asked Persephone about the increase in our monthly costs, she explained that it was the result of inflation affecting everything from property maintenance costs to insurance premiums to the various fees associated with managing our investment accounts and legal entities. Her explanations were detailed and plausible, accompanied by documentation showing specific examples of cost increases that were affecting our various investments and operational expenses. The amounts weren't large enough to be concerning given our overall income levels, and I accepted her explanations without conducting any independent analysis of our spending patterns or expense categories. Looking back, this was probably the first sign that I should have been paying more attention to the financial details that I had delegated to Persephone. But at the time, it seemed like a reasonable response to normal economic conditions that were affecting all investors and property owners. The second indication that something unusual was happening came when I received a call from one of our cryptocurrency exchange platforms asking about some large withdrawal transactions that I didn't remember authorizing. When I asked Persephone about these transactions, she explained that she had moved some of our cryptocurrency holdings to new custody solutions that offered better security features and lower fees, part of an ongoing optimization process that she was conducting to improve the safety and efficiency of our crypto asset management. She provided detailed documentation showing the new accounts and custody arrangements, along with explanations of the security improvements and cost savings that these changes would provide. The documentation looked professional and legitimate, and her explanations demonstrated the kind of technical knowledge that I had come to expect from her regarding cryptocurrency management. I appreciated her proactive approach to optimizing our crypto holdings and didn't think to verify the details independently, trusting her judgment and expertise in an area where she had become more knowledgeable about the operational details than I was. The third indication that there might be problems with our investment portfolio came when I received a notice from one of our property management companies asking about late payments on several of our rental properties. According to their records, we were behind on property management fees and maintenance expenses for 3 different properties, something that made no sense given our strong cash flow position and Persephone's careful attention to maintaining all of our accounts and obligations. When I brought this to Persephone's attention, she was clearly frustrated and explained that the property management company had been having problems with their billing and payment systems, causing confusion about which payments had been processed and which were still outstanding. The third indication that there might be problems with our investment portfolio came when I received a notice from one of our property management companies asking about late payments on several of our rental properties. According to their records, we were behind on property management fees and maintenance expenses for 3 different properties, something that made no sense given our strong cash flow position and Persephone's careful attention to maintaining all of our accounts and obligations. When I brought this to Persephone's attention, she was clearly frustrated and explained that the property management company had been having problems with their billing and payment systems, causing confusion about which payments had been processed and which were still outstanding. She showed me bank records indicating that the payments had been made on schedule, and she contacted the property management company immediately to resolve what appeared to be an administrative error on their part. The situation was resolved within a few days, with the property management company acknowledging that there had been problems with their accounting systems that had resulted in incorrectly flagged accounts for several of their clients. The resolution seemed to confirm Persephone's explanation, and I was impressed by how quickly and efficiently she had handled what could have been a significant problem for our rental property operations. These isolated incidents might have been dismissed as normal complications that arise when managing a complex investment portfolio, but they were actually the visible symptoms of a massive fraud that Persephone had been conducting for over 2 years, systematically stealing millions of dollars from our joint investments while maintaining the appearance that everything was operating normally and profitably. The sophistication of her scheme was extraordinary, involving forged documents, fake account statements, shell companies, and a network of accomplices that included her lover, a financial advisor named Sebastian Blackwood, who specialized in helping wealthy individuals hide assets from their spouses and business partners. Sebastian operated what appeared to be a legitimate financial planning practice, but his real business was facilitating financial fraud for clients who were willing to pay substantial fees for his expertise in creating complex legal structures that could obscure ownership and control of valuable assets. His relationship with Persephone had begun as a professional consultation about tax optimization strategies for our investment portfolio, but it had quickly developed into both a romantic affair and a criminal partnership that was designed to systematically transfer our wealth into accounts and entities that Persephone could control independently of our marriage. The mechanics of their scheme were incredibly complex, involving multiple layers of legal entities, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transactions, and forged documents that made it appear that our investments were performing normally while actually being liquidated and transferred to accounts that Sebastian had established in Persephone's name.
They had created fake property management companies that collected our rental income and then transferred it to Persephone's accounts after deducting fictitious expenses for maintenance, repairs, and management fees that were actually just mechanisms for stealing money. They had established fake cryptocurrency exchanges and custody services that appeared to be holding our digital assets while actually providing completely fraudulent account statements that showed balances in transactions that had never occurred. They had created fake investment funds and lending platforms that claimed to be generating returns on our capital while actually just recycling small portions of stolen money to create the appearance of legitimate investment income.
The monthly financial reports that Persephone provided were masterpieces of financial fraud, combining real data from some of our legitimate investments with completely fabricated information about assets and income streams that no longer existed or had never existed in the first place. The scope of the theft was staggering when I eventually discovered what had been happening, totaling over $8 million that had been stolen from our joint accounts and investments over a period of nearly 3 years. The stolen money had been used to fund Persephone's increasingly expensive lifestyle, including luxury purchases that she claimed were being paid for by her own separate investment activities, expensive trips and entertainment that she said were business-related expenses for managing our portfolio, and substantial payments to Sebastian for both his professional services and personal gifts that were part of their romantic relationship. More significantly, large portions of the stolen money had been invested in legitimate assets that were titled in Persephone's name alone or in the names of legal entities that she controlled without my involvement, creating a shadow portfolio that was potentially worth millions of dollars and that would have been extremely difficult to recover even if the theft had been detected immediately. Sebastian's role in the scheme expanded far beyond providing technical expertise about financial structures and legal entities. He was also responsible for creating the false documentation that made the fraud possible and for managing the complex logistics of moving money between accounts and jurisdictions in ways that would be difficult to trace. His professional credentials as a licensed financial advisor provided credibility for the various fake investment opportunities and custody arrangements that were central to the scheme, and his network of professional contacts allowed him to create realistic-looking documentation and account statements that could withstand casual scrutiny from accountants and attorneys who were not specifically looking for evidence of fraud. Most importantly, Sebastian was responsible for planning the exit strategy that would allow Persephone to divorce me while claiming that our assets had been lost through poor investment decisions or market volatility rather than through systematic theft, potentially leaving me with responsibility for debts and obligations that had been created through the fraudulent schemes while she escaped with millions of dollars in assets that had been stolen and hidden over multiple years. The discovery of this fraud happened almost by accident when I decided to conduct a comprehensive review of our investment portfolio as part of planning for some major purchases and lifestyle changes that Persephone and I had been discussing. I wanted to have a clear understanding of our exact financial position before making commitments that would affect our long-term cash flow and asset allocation, so I contacted all of our investment account custodians, property management companies, and other service providers to request current statements and documentation that would allow me to prepare an accurate net worth analysis. What I discovered was that several of our largest investment accounts had been closed months or even years earlier, that multiple rental properties had been sold without my knowledge, and that our cryptocurrency holdings were significantly smaller than I had believed based on the monthly reports that Persephone had been providing. The discrepancies were so large and so numerous that they couldn't possibly be explained by administrative errors or misunderstandings about account structures. And I immediately knew that something fundamentally wrong had been happening with our finances for an extended period of time. My first reaction was to assume that we had been the victims of external fraud, perhaps identity theft or hacking that had compromised our accounts and allowed criminals to steal our assets while providing false information to cover their tracks. I spent several days working with customer service representatives from various financial institutions trying to understand how our accounts had been compromised and what steps could be taken to recover our stolen assets and secure our remaining investments.
However, as I delved deeper into the details of the fraudulent transactions and forged documentation, it became clear that the theft could only have been conducted by someone with intimate knowledge of our financial systems and legal access to our accounts and documents. The forged signatures on various documents were extremely sophisticated, nearly perfect replications of my handwriting that would have required extensive practice and access to legitimate samples of my signature from other documents. The knowledge of account numbers, passwords, and security procedures that would have been necessary to conduct many of the fraudulent transactions was information that only Persephone and I had access to. And the timing of various transactions corresponded perfectly with periods when I had been traveling or otherwise distracted from monitoring our investment activities. The emotional impact of realizing that Persephone had been systematically stealing from me for years was even more devastating than the financial losses, because it meant that everything I had believed about our marriage, our partnership, and our shared goals had been elaborate lies designed to facilitate theft. Every conversation we had about our financial strategies, every decision we made about investments and purchases, every intimate moment when we had discussed our dreams and plans for the future had been contaminated by her secret agenda to rob me of everything we had built together.
The woman I loved and trusted more than anyone in the world had been playing an entirely different game than I was, using my own success and generosity against me in ways that reveal the level of calculation and betrayal that I would never have imagined possible from someone who seemed to love me as much as I loved her. The discovery process took several weeks as I worked with forensic accountants and attorneys to trace the full extent of the theft and to identify all of the various accounts, entities, and assets that had been involved in Persephone's scheme. The investigation revealed that she had been planning the fraud almost from the beginning of our marriage, gradually taking control of more and more of our financial affairs while building the infrastructure of shell companies and false documentation that would be necessary to steal large amounts of money without immediate detection. Her relationship with Sebastian had begun within months of our wedding, initially as a professional consultation, but quickly developing into both a romantic affair and a criminal conspiracy that was designed to systematically loot our joint assets while maintaining the facade of a successful marriage and investment portfolio. The evidence against both of them was overwhelming and undeniable, including bank records, forged documents, recorded phone conversations, and other documentation that clearly showed their conspiracy to defraud me over a period of multiple years. The civil litigation to recover the stolen assets was complex and expensive, involving multiple jurisdictions and requiring extensive investigation to locate and freeze assets that had been hidden in various accounts and legal entities. My attorneys were able to obtain restraining orders that prevented Persephone and Sebastian from transferring additional assets while the investigation continued, but much of the stolen money had already been spent on lifestyle expenses or invested in assets that were difficult to locate and recover. The criminal proceedings moved more quickly, as the evidence of forgery, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy was clear and comprehensive enough that prosecutors were confident of obtaining convictions, even if the defendants chose to contest the charges rather than negotiating plea agreements. Persephone was arrested at our home on a Tuesday morning while I was meeting with attorneys, and the expression of shock and betrayal on her face when she realized that I had discovered her scheme was almost satisfying enough to compensate for the years of lies and theft she had inflicted on me.
Sebastian was arrested at his office the same day, and the simultaneous raids on their homes and businesses yielded additional evidence of the conspiracy and helped locate assets that might otherwise have been hidden or transferred beyond the reach of law enforcement. The media attention surrounding the case was intense, but generally sympathetic to my situation as the victim of sophisticated financial fraud conducted by trusted family members and professional advisors. Several news outlets wrote detailed articles about the case, describing it as an example of how even experienced investors could be vulnerable to manipulation by people with intimate access to their financial affairs and decision-making processes. The coverage actually enhanced my credibility in the investment community, as other professionals recognized that the sophistication of the fraud reflected the criminal skills of the perpetrators rather than any negligence or poor judgment on my part. My reputation as a successful investor and speaker was not damaged by the scandal, and I actually received numerous invitations to speak about the experience and the lessons it had taught about the importance of maintaining oversight and verification procedures even in intimate personal relationships. The legal proceedings took nearly 2 years to resolve completely, but the outcomes were more favorable than I had initially expected given the complexity of the fraud and the number of jurisdictions involved. Persephone ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, with orders to pay full restitution for the stolen assets. Sebastian received a longer sentence of 7 years because of his professional status and his role as the architect of the fraud, and he was permanently barred from working in the financial services industry. Both of them were required to cooperate with asset recovery efforts, and the civil litigation was ultimately successful in recovering approximately 60% of the stolen money, though the process was expensive and time-consuming. The recovery was sufficient to restore much of my financial position, though not enough to fully compensate for the losses and the legal expenses that had been necessary to pursue the case. The aftermath of discovering Persephone's betrayal required completely rebuilding my approach to both investment management and personal relationships, as I struggled to understand how someone I had trusted completely could have been systematically destroying everything we had supposedly been building together for our shared future. The psychological impact of learning that my marriage had been essentially a long-term criminal enterprise was more difficult to recover from than the financial losses, because it forced me to question my judgment about people and situations in fundamental ways that affected every aspect of how I interacted with the world.
The first year after Persephone's arrest was probably the most challenging period of my adult life, as I dealt with the public embarrassment of having been so thoroughly deceived, the complex legal proceedings that were necessary to recover stolen assets and secure criminal convictions, and the deeper personal work of understanding how I had been manipulated so effectively for such an extended period without detecting any of the obvious warning signs that should have alerted me to what was happening. The media coverage of the case was generally sympathetic, but it still felt humiliating to have my private financial affairs discussed in public forums and to be portrayed as someone who had been naive enough to allow his wife to steal millions of dollars over multiple years without noticing anything suspicious about her activities or explanations. The forensic accounting process that was necessary to trace all of the stolen assets and fraudulent transactions was emotionally exhausting as well as financially expensive because it required examining every detail of our financial life during the period when the fraud was occurring and confronting the evidence of Persephone's systematic deception in ways that made it impossible to maintain any illusions about her motivations or feelings toward me. Every monthly report she had provided was revealed to be partially or completely fabricated. Every explanation she had given for unusual transactions or account changes was shown to be a lie designed to cover theft. And every intimate conversation we had about our shared financial goals was recontextualized as part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain my trust while she robbed me. The discovery that our entire marriage had been built on lies was more devastating than the financial losses, because it meant that I had to grieve not just for the money that had been stolen, but for the relationship that I had thought we shared and the future that I had believed we were building together. The therapy process that I engaged in during the first year of recovery was essential for maintaining my mental health and developing strategies for moving forward with my life. But it was also extremely difficult because it required confronting uncomfortable truths about my own psychology and the ways that my personality traits and life experiences had made me vulnerable to Persephone's manipulation. My therapist helped me understand that successful people in competitive fields often develop psychological patterns that make them particularly susceptible to certain types of exploitation, because their success creates both resources that others want to access and personality characteristics that skilled manipulators learn to identify and exploit.
My focus on building wealth and achieving financial independence had made me eager to share my success with someone I loved. My analytical nature had made me receptive to complex explanations that seemed sophisticated and well-researched, and my busy schedule had made me grateful to delegate important responsibilities to someone who seemed competent and trustworthy. These weren't character defects,
but they were vulnerabilities that someone like Persephone could systematically exploit over time through careful observation and strategic manipulation. Understanding these patterns was essential for developing healthier approaches to future relationships and business partnerships. But the process of gaining that understanding was painful and required accepting some responsibility for my own contributions to the situation without minimizing or excusing the criminal behavior of the people who had betrayed me. The financial reconstruction process was somewhat easier than the emotional recovery because I had maintained enough legitimate assets and income-producing investments to provide a solid foundation for rebuilding my wealth over time. The passive income strategies that had made me vulnerable to theft were still fundamentally sound, and the portions of my portfolio that hadn't been compromised by Persephone's fraud continued to generate substantial monthly cash flow that could support my lifestyle while I worked to replace the stolen assets. The real estate investments that remained in my control were performing well. The cryptocurrency holdings that had been stored in wallets that Persephone didn't have access to had appreciated significantly during the period when the fraud was being discovered and prosecuted, and the various alternative investments that hadn't been targeted by her scheme continued to produce steady returns that helped stabilize my overall financial position. The challenge was not so much generating income or building wealth, but rather developing systems and procedures that would prevent similar fraud in the future, while still allowing me to pursue profitable investment opportunities and maintain the passive income lifestyle that had been my primary financial goal. I hired a team of independent professionals, including accountants, attorneys, and investment advisors who had no personal relationships with me and who were specifically tasked with providing oversight and verification of all significant financial decisions and transactions. The cost of this professional oversight was substantial, but it was a necessary investment in security that allowed me to pursue aggressive wealth-building strategies without constantly worrying about being victimized by trusted advisors or family members who might have access to my accounts and decision-making processes.
I also implemented technological solutions, including multi-signature authentication systems, automated reporting and monitoring tools, and redundant record-keeping procedures that would make it much more difficult for any individual to manipulate my financial information or conduct unauthorized transactions without detection. These measures were expensive and sometimes inconvenient, but they provided peace of mind that was worth far more than their cost and actually improved my investment performance by creating additional layers of analysis and verification that caught errors and identified opportunities that might have been missed under less rigorous oversight procedures. The emotional recovery process took much longer than the financial reconstruction, and it required fundamental changes in how I approached personal relationships and trusted other people with access to important aspects of my life. Dating seemed impossible for the first 18 months after Persephone's conviction, not just because of the practical complications of the legal proceedings and media attention, but because the idea of allowing someone new access to my personal life and financial information felt terrifyingly risky after what I had experienced. The few attempts I made to connect with other people romantically ended quickly because I found myself constantly analyzing their motives and looking for signs of deception or manipulation, unable to enjoy the natural development of intimacy because I was so focused on protecting myself from potential betrayal. It took extensive therapy and gradual exposure to low-risk social situations before I felt capable of forming genuine emotional connections with other people, and even then the process was much more cautious and systematic than the passionate and trusting approach that had characterized my marriage to Persephone. The woman I eventually became involved with, a veterinarian named Ophelia, who had no connection to the financial world and no interest in wealth-building strategies, was initially frustrated by my careful approach to our relationship and my insistence on maintaining complete financial independence and separate decision-making processes. However, as she learned more about what I had experienced with Persephone, she came to understand that my caution was not a reflection of distrust toward her personally, but rather a necessary boundary that allowed me to feel secure enough to develop emotional intimacy without constantly worrying about potential exploitation or manipulation. Our relationship developed slowly over more than a year based on shared values, intellectual compatibility, and gradually building trust, rather than on the intense passion and lifestyle compatibility that had characterized my marriage to Persephone.
Ophelia's approach to money and material possessions was completely different from Persephone's, focused on experiences and relationships rather than acquisition and optimization. And her financial independence and professional success meant that she had no reason to be interested in my wealth except to the extent that it allowed us to enjoy experiences together that we both valued. The contrast between the two relationships was educational about the difference between genuine partnership and sophisticated manipulation. And spending time with someone who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with my financial success helped restore my confidence in my ability to form authentic connections with other people who had honest motives and genuine interest in building a life together rather than exploiting access to my resources. The professional lessons from the Persephone experience had lasting effects on how I managed my investment activities and structured my business relationships, leading to comprehensive changes in procedures and oversight mechanisms that significantly improved both security and performance of my wealth-building activities. I established multiple independent verification systems that required confirmation from different professionals before any significant financial decisions could be implemented, created detailed audit trails for all transactions and account changes, and instituted regular third-party reviews of my investment performance and asset allocation that would identify any irregularities or suspicious patterns before they could develop into major problems. These measures were initially expensive and sometimes slowed down the implementation of time-sensitive investment opportunities, but they actually improved my long-term returns by eliminating emotional and impulsive decisions while ensuring that all investment activities were subjected to rigorous analysis and risk assessment before capital was committed. The enhanced oversight also attracted additional investment partners and clients who valued the transparency and risk management that my procedures represented, and I was eventually able to launch a new investment fund that specialized in passive income strategies for high-net-worth individuals who wanted to achieve financial independence without the risks associated with active business operations or speculative trading activities. The fund was successful from its inception, growing to over $200 million in assets under management within 3 years, and the performance was consistently superior to comparable investment vehicles because of the systematic and disciplined approach that I had developed through the painful experience of rebuilding my wealth after being victimized by financial fraud. The broader perspective that emerged from the Persephone experience was that building lasting wealth requires not just technical knowledge and investment skills, but also the wisdom to recognize that success creates vulnerabilities that must be actively managed through appropriate systems, boundaries, and professional relationships.
Wealthy individuals and successful investors are inherently attractive targets for various forms of exploitation, and protecting accumulated assets requires the same level of attention and sophistication that goes into building them in the first place. The mistake I had made was assuming that personal relationships were exempt from the careful analysis and risk management that I applied to business relationships, when in fact, intimate relationships often involve even greater potential for both benefit and harm because they involve emotional as well as financial stakes. The recovery process also involved rebuilding relationships with friends and family members who had been affected by the scandal and who sometimes struggled to understand how someone with my level of financial sophistication could have been so thoroughly deceived by people they had known and trusted. Some relationships were permanently damaged because people concluded that I must have been willfully ignorant of obvious warning signs, or that my focus on wealth accumulation had somehow contributed to the betrayal I had experienced. However, most of the important people in my life ultimately came to understand that sophisticated fraud is designed to be undetectable, and that victims of financial manipulation should not be blamed for the criminal behavior of perpetrators who exploit trust and intimacy for personal gain. The support of friends and family was crucial during the most difficult periods of the legal proceedings and emotional recovery process, and their acceptance and understanding helped me maintain perspective about the fact that one person's betrayal did not reflect on my fundamental worth or judgment as a human being. 3 years after Persephone's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from her while she was serving her prison sentence, attempting to explain her behavior and express remorse for what she had done to our marriage and my financial security.
The letter was clearly written with assistance from prison counselors and legal advisors, and it was probably motivated more by her desire to improve her chances for early parole than by genuine remorse or desire for reconciliation. However, it did provide some insight into her mindset during the years when she had been systematically betraying me and stealing from our joint investments. She claimed that she had initially entered our marriage with genuine feelings and honest intentions, but had gradually become resentful of what she perceived as my emotional unavailability and obsessive focus on building wealth rather than enjoying the lifestyle that our success had made possible. According to her version of events, the affair with Sebastian had begun as an emotional escape from loneliness in our marriage, and the financial fraud had developed gradually as a way to assert some independence and prepare for what she had come to see as the inevitable end of our relationship. She claimed that the theft had never been intended to reach the scale that it ultimately achieved, but that each individual transaction had seemed justified at the time as a reasonable response to circumstances that felt beyond her control.
The explanation was self-serving and failed to acknowledge the calculated and systematic nature of what she had done over multiple years. But it was consistent with patterns that I had learned about in therapy regarding how people rationalize behavior that they know is wrong but that serves immediate emotional or practical needs. Reading the letter was painful, but also helpful in providing some closure about questions that had troubled me since discovering her betrayal, and I was able to respond with forgiveness for my own psychological benefit while maintaining appropriate boundaries about any future contact or relationship. The letter from Persephone marked a turning point in my emotional recovery, not because it provided satisfactory explanations for her behavior, but because it helped me realize that I had moved beyond needing her validation or understanding in order to rebuild my life and move forward with confidence and purpose. The years of therapy, legal proceedings, and gradual reconstruction of my financial and personal relationships had created a foundation of self-knowledge and resilience that no longer required external confirmation or approval to maintain stability and direction. I was able to read her attempts at explanation and apology with detachment rather than anger, recognizing them as primarily self-serving rather than genuinely remorseful, but also understanding that her motivations for writing were less important than my own ability to process the information without being emotionally destabilized or drawn back into the psychological patterns that had made me vulnerable to her manipulation in the first place. The response I sent back was brief and formal, acknowledging receipt of her letter while making it clear that I had no interest in resuming any form of personal relationship or ongoing correspondence, but also expressing forgiveness in the sense of releasing myself from continued anger and resentment rather than excusing or minimizing what she had done to me and our marriage. Forgiving Persephone was ultimately about my own psychological health and freedom rather than about her rehabilitation or redemption, and it represented a crucial step in completing the emotional recovery process that had begun when I first discovered the extent of her betrayal and theft. The financial recovery had been substantially completed by this point, with my net worth restored to levels that exceeded my pre-fraud position, and my passive income streams generating monthly cash flow that was higher and more stable than what I had achieved during my marriage to Persephone. The investment fund that I had launched was performing exceptionally well, attracting additional capital from sophisticated investors who valued the systematic approach and comprehensive oversight procedures that I had developed through the painful experience of rebuilding after financial fraud. My reputation in the investment community had actually been enhanced by the way I'd handled the crisis, demonstrating resilience, transparency, and commitment to ethical practices that were highly valued by institutional investors and high-net-worth individuals who were looking for trustworthy partners for their wealth management needs.
The speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that had emerged from my experience had developed into a secondary income stream that was both financially rewarding and personally fulfilling, allowing me to help other investors avoid similar situations while sharing practical strategies for building and protecting passive income portfolios. My relationship with Ophelia had deepened into something that felt much more authentic and sustainable than what I had experienced with Persephone, based on genuine compatibility and shared values rather than on lifestyle considerations or financial objectives. We had been living together for over a year by this point, though we maintained completely separate financial affairs and decision-making processes in ways that might have seemed unusual to other couples but that worked perfectly for our specific situation and history. Ophelia's understanding of why these boundaries were necessary for my psychological security, combined with her own independent success and lack of interest in my wealth-building activities, created a dynamic that felt both intimate and safe in ways that I had never experienced before. The contrast with my previous marriage was instructive about the difference between relationships that are built on genuine partnership versus those that are constructed around exploitation and manipulation, and spending time with someone who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with my financial resources helped restore my confidence in my ability to form authentic connections with people who had honest motivations and sincere interest in building a life together. We began discussing marriage during our second year together, but both of us recognized that my previous experience required a different approach to legal and financial structures than most couples would consider necessary or appropriate. The prenuptial agreement that we eventually negotiated was comprehensive and detailed, protecting both of our separate assets and income streams while establishing clear procedures for any shared financial decisions or joint investments that we might choose to make in the future. The process of negotiating these arrangements was actually helpful for our relationship because it required us to discuss our values, priorities, and expectations in explicit terms rather than making assumptions about compatibility that might prove to be mistaken over time. Ophelia's willingness to accept the complex legal and financial arrangements that I needed for psychological security was evidence of her genuine commitment to our partnership and her understanding of the unique challenges that my previous experience had created for future relationships. Our wedding was a small, private ceremony that focused on the personal and spiritual aspects of our commitment rather than on celebration or public recognition, and the legal protections we had established allowed both of us to enter the marriage with complete confidence that our individual achievements and financial security would be preserved regardless of what might happen to our relationship in the future. The marriage represented a successful completion of my personal recovery process, demonstrating that it was possible to rebuild trust and intimacy after experiencing profound betrayal, while still maintaining appropriate boundaries and protections against future exploitation. The professional success that had emerged from my experience with financial fraud continued to grow and develop in directions that I had never anticipated when I first began rebuilding my wealth and reputation. The investment fund had grown to over $500 million in assets under management, generating substantial management fees that provided financial security independent of my personal investment activities. The systematic approach to passive income investing that I had developed attracted attention from academic researchers and financial institutions who were interested in understanding and replicating the risk management and oversight procedures that had allowed me to achieve consistent returns while avoiding the types of fraud and manipulation that had previously devastated my portfolio. I was invited to serve on advisory boards for several financial services companies, to contribute articles to professional publications, and to participate in regulatory discussions about investor protection and fraud prevention that were taking place at the federal level in response to increasing awareness of the vulnerabilities that wealthy individuals faced from trusted advisors and family members who had access to their financial affairs. These professional activities were intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding, but more importantly, they provided a sense of purpose and contribution that went beyond personal wealth accumulation to include helping other people protect themselves from the types of exploitation that I had experienced. The speaking and consulting work had developed into a comprehensive educational program that I offered to family offices, investment clubs, and professional organizations that wanted to help their members understand the warning signs of financial fraud and the systems that could be implemented to prevent or detect theft by trusted advisors, staff members, or family members who had access to their accounts and decision-making processes. The program was based on real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and participants appreciated the practical insights and specific recommendations that came from someone who had actually lived through the experience of discovering and recovering from systematic financial betrayal. The demand for these educational services was much higher than I had expected, indicating that financial fraud within families and trusted relationships was a more widespread problem than most people realized, and that there was significant value in sharing practical strategies for prevention and detection that had been developed through actual experience rather than academic research.
The broader impact of my experience and the educational work that had emerged from it was to help change conversations within the wealth management industry about the importance of verification procedures, independent oversight, and systematic audit processes that could protect clients from exploitation by advisors, staff members, or family members who had access to their accounts and decision-making processes.
Several major financial institutions adopted policies and procedures that were directly influenced by recommendations from my educational programs, and regulatory agencies began requiring enhanced disclosure and verification procedures that would make it more difficult for financial advisors to facilitate the types of fraud that Sebastian had conducted on behalf of Persephone. The professional recognition and influence that came from these activities was gratifying, but the most meaningful aspect was the feedback I received from individuals who had attended my presentations or read my articles, and who subsequently discovered and prevented fraud attempts that might otherwise have resulted in significant financial losses. Knowing that my painful experience could be transformed into practical knowledge that helped other people protect themselves and their families provided a sense of redemption and purpose that went far beyond financial recovery or personal healing. 5 years after Persephone's conviction, I received notification that she was being released from federal prison after serving her full sentence, and that she would be relocating to a different state to begin the process of rebuilding her life under the supervision of federal probation officers. The restitution payments that she was required to make would continue for many years, ensuring that she would never be able to completely escape the financial consequences of her criminal behavior. But the criminal justice aspect of the case was essentially concluded with her release. I felt no desire for revenge or continued punishment, but I also had no interest in any form of contact or reconciliation that might complicate the life and relationships that I had built during the years since discovering her betrayal. The person I had become through the process of recovery and reconstruction was fundamentally different from the person who had been victimized by her manipulation, stronger and wiser in ways that made future exploitation much less likely, while also more capable of forming authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility. Sebastian was released several months later after serving his full sentence, and he was required to relocate and find employment in fields unrelated to financial services, permanently banned from the industry where he had used his professional credentials to facilitate fraud. The complete destruction of his career and reputation was a more severe consequence than the prison sentence, because it meant that he would never again have access to the resources and professional relationships that had made his criminal activities possible. Both of them had paid substantial prices for their choices, but the consequences they faced were the natural result of their own decisions and actions, rather than punishment that I had sought or imposed, and their fates were less important to my ongoing happiness and success than the positive relationships and activities that now filled my life.
The investment fund continued to grow and prosper, eventually reaching over $1 billion in assets under management and generating returns that consistently exceeded industry benchmarks while maintaining the conservative risk profile that was appropriate for investors seeking stable passive income rather than speculative gains. The success of the fund validated the investment philosophy and risk management approaches that I had developed through years of experience, including the painful lessons learned from being victimized by financial fraud. The comprehensive oversight procedures and verification systems that were central to the fund's operations became models that other investment managers adopted to protect their own clients from similar risks. And the fund's reputation for transparency and security attracted capital from some of the most sophisticated and demanding investors in the world. My marriage to Ophelia continued to thrive based on mutual respect, shared values, and the healthy boundaries that protected both of our independence and financial security while allowing us to build a life together that was both intimate and sustainable. We traveled extensively, pursued hobbies and interests that we were passionate about, and generally enjoyed the freedom and security that came from financial independence without the stress and complications that had characterized my previous marriage.
The difference between a relationship built on genuine compatibility and one constructed around financial considerations was profound and obvious in every aspect of our daily life together, confirming that the careful approach we had taken to protecting our individual assets and maintaining separate decision-making processes had actually enhanced rather than diminished our emotional intimacy and partnership. The educational work and professional recognition that had emerged from my experience continued to provide intellectual stimulation and a sense of contribution that went beyond personal financial success to include helping other people avoid similar situations and build more secure approaches to wealth management and family financial planning. The combination of financial independence, meaningful work, and authentic personal relationships represented a level of life satisfaction that exceeded anything I had experienced during my marriage to Persephone, despite the material luxury and apparent success that had characterized that period of my life. The most important lesson that emerged from the entire experience was that true security comes not from accumulating wealth or achieving passive income targets, but from developing the wisdom to recognize and protect against the various forms of exploitation that success inevitably attracts, while building genuine relationships with people who value you for reasons that transcend financial considerations. Wealth and financial independence are valuable tools for creating freedom and security, but they are also sources of vulnerability that require active management and protection through appropriate systems, boundaries, and relationships with trustworthy professionals and partners. The passive income strategies that had made me vulnerable to Persephone's theft were still fundamentally sound and continued to generate substantial returns, but they were now protected by oversight procedures and verification systems that made systematic fraud much more difficult to conduct and much easier to detect before it could reach devastating proportions. The approach to wealth building that I had developed through the process of recovery was more sophisticated and secure than what I had practiced during my marriage, incorporating both technical improvements in investment strategies and psychological insights about the human factors that create vulnerabilities in financial planning and decision-making processes. The speaking and consulting work that allowed me to share these insights with other investors and financial professionals provided income and professional satisfaction, but more importantly, it created a sense of purpose and contribution that transformed a painful personal experience into valuable knowledge that could help other people protect themselves and their families from similar exploitation.